Hello and welcome to our webinar on the new Value for Money standards. I'm chairing this session. My name is Stephen Cook. I'm an associate with HUN working on the Residents Network. And today I'm really pleased to be joined by Joseph Carr, who will be taking us through a presentation on the new standards. So without any further ado, I'll welcome you, Joseph, and pass over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, my name is Joseph Carr, and I'm the Director of JC&A Consulting. About 2 weeks ago, the Regulator for Social Housing finally published the long-awaited revised Value for Money standard, and with it, the associated Code of Practice. The purpose of today's webinar is to highlight the key changes and what these might mean for housing association residents. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to look at the background and context of these changes. I'm then going to outline the main changes. And finally, I want to focus on what this might mean for housing association residents and housing association resident groups such as the Housing Association Scrutiny Panel. So first, I'm going to, as I say, look at the background and context of these changes. I've been in the social housing sector probably for about 3 decades and a bit more, and housing policy has never been such a hot topic. It's certainly not been such a hot topic since the 1950s. And what is clear is that all the political parties have acknowledged that housing is an issue and it's in a desperate state, both in terms of affordability for either rent or properties to buy, the quantity of available social housing, and people getting on the social housing or the housing ladder. Housing associations are also acknowledged with local authorities as being quite central to this. And for example, in 2015, 2016, 30% of the homes produced were produced by housing associations. Politicians have got involved and tried to help the process. So at the last budget, £2 billion were announced for new affordable homes, and for the first time for a long time, this included new social homes. There's been a restoration of the CPI plus 1% rent inflator, and also the removal of the threat of the local housing allowance cap. And all of this has been to focus on the delivery of new homes, and sends a signal really to housing associations and local authorities that they've got to really step up and meet this challenge. You might therefore ask, what has this all got to do with value for money? Well, whether we like it or not, there's been a perception for a long time, certainly in relation to housing associations, that perhaps they're not as efficient as they could be. And if you compare housing associations to private companies have stakeholders who insist on driving down costs and maximising returns. And as a result, the political parties have put a lot of pressure on the Regulator for Social Housing to ensure that housing associations reduce their costs, improve their practices so they're more efficient, and really demonstrate value for money as part of their day-to-day business practice. And this leads us quite nicely on to why we have a new value for money standard. Now, you might say, so what? Who really cares? What is this standard directed to? Well, in my view, the primary audience for the new value for money standard is existing and future tenants. And there's a role here for tenants and tenant groups to really hold landlords to account to make sure they deliver value for money. And I guess the prize there is that if housing associations and other landlords deliver value for money, there'll be more money, more surpluses available to either improve existing homes or to invest in new stock. In addition to residents, the regulator is also interested, as are the governments. And if you're a funder or an investor, you want to know that housing associations will be running away so they can service debt. And there are other wider stakeholders that are interested in housing associations delivering value for money. So that takes us nicely on to how the new standard will be applied and some of the main changes. In terms of applying value for money, the group that's going to be most involved in this is the boards of housing associations. They've got to ensure that value for money is actually achieved on a day-to-day basis. But the regulator will also have a say both in setting standards and to ensuring that minimum outcomes are described. The new standard will only apply to private registered providers, in other words, housing associations. It will not apply to public registered providers, local authorities, because there's a different regulatory relationship between local authorities and the regulator. The new standard will apply to all areas of housing association activity, so that will include its commercial activity, and it will apply to all housing associations, very large ones, or the smaller housing associations with 1,000 or fewer homes. And there is also an expectation from the regulator that housing associations will reflect the new requirements in the 2017-2018 financial returns. So now I want to overview some of the changes. First, a minute on the old standard. The old standard was very narrative-based, and housing associations produced pages and pages of value for money expectations and performance. And in my view, it was very difficult to audit these claims through to housing associations' records and their financial statements, let alone compare what one housing association did in terms of value for money compared to the next. And as a result, in my view, the new standard is a welcome relief. It's good news. It's outcomes focused, and I'll talk about this a bit more. It's shorter, sharper, and much more transparent. And so it's easier to compare what housing associations say they'll do in terms of value for money to how they perform. And it also provides a better basis to compare one housing association to the next. The other big change with the new standard is that it requires housing associations to set value for money targets at a strategic level. And these value for money targets should achieve a couple of things. Firstly, it should achieve something called optimal benefit. Now, what is that all about? Well, it's about the approach housing associations take to remunerating the board and staff at all levels. And it's also about housing associations not necessarily looking to maximize financial returns, which was what the original draft says, but to optimize financial return. And what that's about is that housing associations are social benefit organisations. So, for example, they set sub-market rents. So it's not about getting top dollar. It's about achieving social value and achieving their purpose. The other thing in relation to optimal benefit, the new value for money standards will require housing associations to compare their existing structure and existing operating models to alternatives. So housing associations will need to consider whether or not they should diversify into other areas, whether or not they should think about selling off some of their existing operations if they're not achieving the desired outcome, whether or not housing associations should be involved in non-social activity, and also housing association partnerships and mergers. So something housing associations need to constantly keep on their agenda. So that's the overview. Perhaps in a bit more detail, a bit more specifics, the new standard requires housing associations to, on an ongoing basis, focus on costs and optimizing use of assets and resources. And as the left-hand side of this slide shows, they need to consider on a regular basis different modes of operation. The standard is also very big on reporting. So housing associations will report on the performance against standards in their financial statements. They will report initially performance against the targets we discussed. They'll report against the regulator's value for money metrics. I'm going to come on to that in the next couple of slides. And also how housing associations compares to their peers. Now, where housing associations underperform, that too needs to be reported on, and how housing associations will mitigate this. Now, in my view, this is a good role for a tenant scrutiny panel. It can hold housing associations to account and make sure housing associations do what they're saying they're going to do. Also published with the Value for Money standard is something called the Value for Money Code of Practice. What is that? Well, this Code of Practice really amplifies the standard and gives an indication of how the code could be applied to. And so again, another in for residents and resident representation groups. It will allow them to assess the extent to which housing associations are meeting the spirit of the standard. Having said that, the code has no formal regulatory standing. And so whilst it's there to provide an explanation of how the standard should be applied, where it proves to be inconsistent, the regulator will always defer to the standard. The standard, as I said earlier, requires that housing associations demonstrate that they're performing to the standard. There are 7 metrics introduced in the standard. In my view, these metrics are largely financially based, and that's deliberate on the part of the regulator. The regulator didn't want housing associations to do lots more extra work in order to report value for money. So many of the metrics are things that housing associations would report in other regulatory returns. As a result, in my view, the value of these metrics have limited use to residents and residents groups because it doesn't really reflect on things like service delivery or social value. Having said that, there are some benefits to be had. The 5th metric, social housing costs, will include a measure of staff costs, and so that will be of interest to housing association groups. It will also housing association resident groups. It will also include a measure of repairs and maintenance, and again, a scrutiny panel might be interested in that too. Similarly, the 6 metrics, operating margins, also provides a measure of how efficient the housing association is and the surpluses they generate, and this will allow housing associations the latitude to invest in existing services and also to have a discretion on making investment in new supply. So these metrics, as I said earlier, will allow peer-to-peer comparison and also a measure of performance against targets. So that's as much as I wanted to say about the new standards. What I want to do now, one other point. The regulator also allows housing associations to introduce additional metrics where that gives a better measure of value for money. And so this too is an opportunity for a housing association residents group to work with the housing association to introduce new metrics that might reflect on things like service costs and other things that might be more relevant and of more interest to housing association residents. I now want to say a bit more about how the new standard reflects on housing association groups. I'm going to talk a little bit about sector scorecards on my first slide, and then to what extent housing associations can decide between investing in new supply and in existing homes. So, housing association spec sector scorecards. There are 15 of these sector scorecards. The sector scorecard was kind of a pre-runner before the value for money standard. It consisted, as I said earlier, of 15 efficiency measures separated into 5 groups. The first 4, in my review, are very similar to the regulator's value for money metrics and don't really provide anything over and above sort of financial measures. The one that housing association residents groups will find more interesting is outcomes delivered. And I'm going to say more about this in the next slide. So outcomes delivered. There are already three agreed measures. One on customer satisfaction, and that's a survey that housing associations put out to their residents annually. And the results are going to be fed back. Housing associations also will be required to indicate the pounds they invest in new housing supply based on the surpluses they generate from the ordinary activity. And similarly, housing associations will also report back on the investments in pounds terms they make in the community based on their operating surpluses. But I would suggest that there is a scope to go a bit further. If I was a housing association resident, I'd want to know to what extent the rent I'm charged compares to other residents in my housing association, and more widely in comparison with other housing associations. And this is an opportunity for a tenant scrutiny group or other housing association resident group to get involved with housing associations to perhaps get these changed and these new measures incorporated. Similarly, I'd like to know the service charges being levied on me, how that compares to other residents in my housing associations and more widely. And then if I might want to know how my repairs are carried out compared to this organisation and other housing associations. So plenty of scope there for resident groups to get involved. Moving on now to something that came up when the new standard was being devised. There were various objectives set by the regulator, and the first of these I think is quite interesting. There's discussion here about encouraging investment in existing homes and new housing supply. Now that sets a role there for housing association boards to strike a balance between the appropriate balance of investing in existing stock, investing in improvements in services for tenants, and for investing in new development. And again, housing association representative groups can get involved with boards to ensure that this balance is right and investment in existing stock and current services meets the requirements of residents. That takes me onto my penultimate slide, and it's a question for you, housing association residents. What is it you understand about value for money? What does it mean for you? Certainly HQN would be very keen to know what it is you want to do and how HQN can help you to assist you in doing this. And this slide demonstrates a number of ways HQN can help. At this point, I want to hand the presentation back to Stephen and respond to any questions.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. Very comprehensive, very comprehensive. I guess looking at what you presented there, would it be fair to say that on one level, the standards come across as being very prescriptive? There are documents for the board and the regulator to get involved with. But your latter slides were indicating that the spirit of the standards will enable residents to get involved in setting local standards, but also perhaps that a really good landlord will find innovative ways to report back to its tenants on its progress. So perhaps, is it fair to say that on a good close reading is not quite such a dry document as it would appear to the technocrats?
I think that's a really good question, and I think I should acknowledge there is a dryness about this. That's deliberate because it standardizes things and allows comparison from one association to the next, and for one association to compare its performance to its target. But you are equally correct in that there are two or three points in the process where a housing association resident and housing association resident group can actually work with the board to introduce new measures that look at areas that are outside of the standard, at things like, well, customer satisfaction, one I mentioned in the talk, and that will allow these to be more useful to residents and residents groups and to really hold housing associations to account.
So this is really a chance for this piece of legislation as such to save money for associations, to help drive service improvement and also maybe increase customer and resident engagement.
Absolutely. Good opportunity for all of those, particularly resident engagement. And now's a good time because housing associations will be getting their head around what the new requirements are, devising a new strategy, a new approach to value for money. And now's a good time to influence change whilst things are still being designed.
Oh, absolutely. No, thanks for that, Joseph. That's a really good presentation. And I think it gives us a very good indication that we're at the start of the journey, and as you say, we've got the chance to influence how this settles in and beds into the sector. So, Joseph, thank you very much for your contribution today. Thanks very much indeed, and I hope you've enjoyed this webinar brought to you by HQN, and we hope to hear from you with your views on this in due course. Goodbye.